Welcome, everyone, to Socialist Action's webinar analyzing the historic defeat of the United States in Afghanistan. Today, I'm joined by two wonderful social justice anti-war activist fighters from Socialist Action Canada, our sister party. We have Barry Weissletter, a long-term activist in the anti-war movement in Canada. Barry is joined with us by Joe Lombardo, who is the national coordinator of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition. Both Joe and Barry have been lifers in the anti-war movement going back to the war in Vietnam. I couldn't help but make some comparisons. By the way, I'm Jeff Mackler, the National Secretary of Socialist Action and a member of the Administrative Committee of United National Anti-War Coalition. That's a national anti-war coalition that has called mass demonstrations against all US wars. We are against the US wars against working people at home and imperialist wars abroad. I couldn't help but think of the comparison of the Vietnam War to the Afghan War. Both ended in a massive defeat on the part of the world's greatest military power. In Vietnam, the United States rained down death and destruction on the Vietnamese people more than all of the bombs dropped during the World War I and World War II. The result was 4 million Vietnamese dead. 57,000 GIs lost their lives. I couldn't resist the calculation. That is what the United States government described as the kill ratio. In Vietnam, it was 1 US soldier to every 70 Vietnamese. The kill ratio in the modern era, in the Afghan war, after 20 years of slaughter in that country, after killing 500,000 at least Vietnamese, and 2,000 GIs lost their lives, was an astonishing 250 to 1. For every young American soldier who died, 250 Afghans were slaughtered. That's modern warfare for you. The Taliban, who are now in control of Afghanistan, are called terrorists. They use high-tech weapons like planting bombs in the dirt or an occasional suicide bomb. The United States, of course, is not terrorists, but the United States has slaughtered through modern warfare, drone warfare, special operations warfare, secret death squad warfare, CIA warfare, not to mention bombings with the most sophisticated aircraft in the world. The combined total is at least 500,000, and some say 1 million Afghans wounded. Their country has been destroyed. The poverty rate is incredible. The 90% of the Afghan people earn less than $2 a day. Its major economic resource, presided over by the US installed government, was poppy cultivation, which it turns into heroin. Afghanistan, under American rule, turned out to be the #1 heroin exporter in the world, accounting for 90% of the world's heroin. Today, if you look at the headlines of the New York Times and virtually every other country, they're bemoaning the fact that the most powerful nation was driven out of Afghanistan. They point out that the US funded Afghan army of 570,000 soldiers surrendered without a fight. Kabul was occupied by the Taliban by literally walking in and driving surrendered American utility vehicles, not to mention tanks. How do we account for the fact that after 20 years, the longest war in US history, the United States stands in abject defeat. Is that a victory for working people? Did the United States achieve anything in the way of, quote, nation building? Did it have a right to be, I quote, nation builder? The nation they built in that country was founded on mass corruption, was founded on the top officials that we appointed stealing millions of dollars and lining their bank accounts. An abject corruption in every institution, with the military, with overt stealing, not to mention assassination squads and death squads. The claim was the United States sought to bring civilization to that country. Did they bring civilization to Vietnam? Did they bring it to Nicaragua, supporting the Contras, where Oliver North, President Reagan's National Security Council advisor, collaborated with the Medellin cartel to bring crack cocaine into US cities to sell to poor blacks in order to raise money for the illegal secret Contra war? Is any war by US imperialism today the coup attempt in Venezuela, the destruction of Syria, 500,000 Syrians dead, the reducing Libya to a failed state? Has any of these wars brought civilization? I can't give the United States an ounce of credit for its military intervention in the world, to the tune of $2.6 trillion expended on the war machine to slaughter innocent people in Afghanistan. In my view, we have a terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy, but it ended in a victory for the Afghan people because at long last, they are free from the American imperialist beast, oppressor, corruption, and mass slaughter. It's now up to the Afghanistan people to decide for themselves what their future will be. In my view, the Taliban is not going to provide a future of freedom and justice, but that's for the Afghan people to decide. The need to form independent mass organizations to fight for workers' rights and peasant rights is preeminent in our way of thinking. But the chances of the Afghan people to do that with the United States imperialist beast out of their country are qualitatively increased. I will only say this. Today, the US Justice Department is seeking the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Assange is threatened with 175 years in prison for the simple fact that he published US Afghan war logs describing the horrors of US policy in Afghanistan, for telling the American people the truth about what the United States has done to that country for 20 years based on their own documents. He's a journalist going to prison for telling the truth. And that's why we demand his freedom and an end to the US effort to extradite him and put him in jail as a journalist. We're for free speech and free press and free journalists and the truth. We have always been for US out of Afghanistan, and indeed for the United States out of every country in the world where it has sanctioned 38 countries because they disagree with their foreign policy. So with that, let's turn to our first speaker, Barry Weisleiter, Federal Secretary of Socialist Action Canada, long-term anti-war activist. Welcome, Barry.
Good evening, and thank you very much to Lisa and to Jeff for organizing this and inviting me to participate, and salutations to my good friend Joe Lombardo, who we have had the joy of hosting on more than one occasion in Toronto and in Canada at anti-war, anti-imperialist events. The quick collapse of the Western government, Western-backed government in Afghanistan revealed how little anyone should trust Canada's military, its arms industry, and their ideological backers. The reasons given for Canada's war in Afghanistan, and it was, let's remember, a coalition, another version of the coalition of the willing, the imperialist powers acting together, The reasons given were to fight fundamentalists, to build democracy, and to support women's rights. But these justifications for war, their claims of progress and then victory, have proven to be no more than propaganda lies. As Afghan women's rights and pro-democracy activist Malalai Joya summarized, I quote, "The Americans replaced the barbaric regime of the Taliban with the brutal warlords and then began to negotiate with the Taliban, even though the nature of the Taliban has never changed. The Americans have thrown bombs, polluted the environment, made the system even more corrupt. They have never been interested in the Afghan people." Quote. The same could be said of Canada's record in Afghanistan. In Canada's biggest military deployment since World War II, more than 40,000 Canadian troops fought in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014 at the cost of $20 billion. The result? Over 200,000 Afghan civilians and combatants were killed in 2 decades of fighting. Canada engaged in significant violence and war crimes in the Central Asian country. This is done under the auspices of NATO, and it's kind of funny that this territory in Central Asia has anything to do with the North Atlantic. This included bombing raids with chemical weapons, patrols that killed civilians, and nighttime assassination raids where a JTF-2 member, that's the Canadian Special Forces, said he felt his commanders encouraged them to commit war crimes. As Chief of Defense Staff Rick Hillier infamously proclaimed, I quote, "We're not just the public service of Canada. We're not just another department. We are the Canadian Forces, and our job is to be able to kill people," close quote. Canada also transferred Afghan detainees over to the repressive Afghan regime for torture, including beatings, whippings, rape, and the use of electricity, knives, and flames. As Maclean's magazine reported in 2006, General Rick Hillier had, quote, "enormous respect for the warlords," close quote. Well, this was not a well-intentioned war whose mission went astray or whose execution was mishandled. Canada's record in Afghanistan mirrored its other military operations from Haiti to Libya. Just before Canada ramped up its fighting in Kandahar in 2006, Canadian troops invaded Haiti to overthrow the elected government. 500 Canadian soldiers backed violent rebels, Haiti's Taliban, if you like, who employed rape as a means of political control. A study in the prestigious Lancet medical journal revealed there were 35,000 rapes in Port-au-Prince area in the 22 months after the overthrow of the elected government. So much for advancing women's rights. The other supposed motivation for the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was to weaken al-Qaeda. As Canadian troops wound down their occupation of Afghanistan, a half-dozen Canadian fighter jets bombed Libya. During the bombing, noted Ottawa Citizen military reporter David Pugilis, Canadian Air Force members privately joked they were part of, quote, al-Qaeda's Air Force, close quote. Lo and behold, these were the major beneficiaries of the war, taking control of significant portions of the country. If fighting extremists, building democracy, and defending women's rights were not Canada's main objectives in Afghanistan, what was? Military service contractors such as SNC-Lavalin and ATCO expanded their involvement with the Canadian forces. During the war in Afghanistan, Canadian Commercial Corporation President Mark Whittingham wrote in the Hill Times, quote, "There is no better trade show for defense equipment than a military mission," close quote. The Crown Corporation has expanded its role in the international weapons trade. The stock price of the biggest Canadian-based arms firm, CAE, has also risen sharply since 2001. It trains US pilots as well as operators of Predator and Reaper drones. The Montreal-based company openly talks about profiting from increased US military spending. And in French, le patron du CAA veut profiter de la hausse des budgets de l'armée américaine. The CAA boss wants to take advantage of rising US military spending. And so read a 2018 La Presse headline. Recently, The Intercept reported that the stock price of the top 5 US firms, the top 5 arms firms in the United States rose tenfold after US President George W. Bush signed the authorization for use of military force in September 18, 2001. Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics all have Canadian subsidiaries. The US-based firms are not simply branch plants. They do research in Canada, have offices near Parliament Hill, and hire former top Canadian military officials. A number of them do international business through their Canadian divisions. General Dynamics Canada, for instance, has the largest ever Canadian export contract selling light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia. Tracing its Canadian history to 1948, General Dynamics has ties to Canadian educational institutions, politicians, and the military. Private security firms also did well in Afghanistan. Conflict in that country helped propel Montreal's Garda to become the biggest privately held security firm in the world with some 80,000 employees. The military conflicts in Afghanistan was a way for the military to increase its profile. There was a surge of martial patriotism in Canada with initiatives such as Highway of Heroes and Project Hero. While the Canadian military abandoned veterans with PTSD, by the mid-2000s, every province adopted a special license plate to signify the driver is a veteran. This was then used to demand more war. As all but Canadian special forces had been withdrawn from Afghanistan in 2012, the chief of the defense staff publicly demanded a new war. Quote, "We have some men and women who have had 2, 3, and 4 tours, and what they're telling me is, sir, we've got that bumper sticker. Can we go somewhere else now?" Close quote. General Walter Natinchuk told Canadian press in 2012, quote, "You also have the young sailors, soldiers, airmen, and women who have just finished basic training and they want to go somewhere. And in their minds, it was going to be Afghanistan. So if not Afghanistan, where is it going to be?" Various think tanks and militarist organizations, such as the Conference of Defense Associations, as well as academics writing on military issues, benefited from millions of dollars in public funds. The war justified an increase in the size of the military and a major spike in military spending. This also produced a surge in Islamophobia and attacks on civil liberties. Former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper declared that the biggest threat to Canada was Islamism, which justified secret trials and deportation to torture and domestic surveillance, and state-sanctioned Islamophobia continues to fuel attacks on Muslim communities. But in 2003, people across Canada saw that the biggest threat was war on Iraq, and a mass movement stopped the Canadian government from directly participating in that. This anti-war success was a major problem for Canadian elites. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Bill Graham explained, quote, "There was no question every time we talked about the Afghan mission, it gave us cover for not going to Iraq," close quote. The war in Afghanistan was good for the arms industry. It also bolstered the Canadian military and helped it recover from its setback in Iraq. But the quick unraveling of 20 years of war and occupation ought to sap some of the power of Canada's military, arms companies, and associated ideological institutions. The quick collapse of the US and Canadian-backed Afghan military and government proves they should not be trusted. Their primary goal is, and always has been, to benefit the military-industrial complex, not to improve the lives of people in other countries. I'll conclude by this quote. Former Liberal leader Michael Ignatieff once claimed that for Afghans, quote, "their best hope of freedom lies in a temporary experience of imperial rule," close quote. But the past 20 years in Afghanistan show that imperial rule is never temporary and never leads to freedom, and that the best hope lies in challenging imperialism and supporting self-determination. As Malalai Joya explained, quote, "No democracy arises from military occupation," close quote. So we say, from our deep experience in the anti-war movement and in collaboration with anti-war allies around the world, hands off Afghanistan, hands off Venezuela, free Julian Assange now. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barry Weisletter, Federal Secretary of Socialist Action Canada. I'd like to encourage our participants, observers, that you can go online and include your comments or questions to our speakers. You can check us out at socialistaction.org. This will be recorded on our YouTube channel, on our website, again, socialistaction.org. So for now, let's go to our next speaker. I'm proud to introduce Joe Lombardo. He's the national coordinator of UNEC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, which opposes all US wars against working people at home and abroad. Joe, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Jeff. Very happy to be here. You know, those of us that have been around in the anti-war movement for a while, including the people who are speaking here today, have seen history repeat itself. Jeff mentioned how he reminded him very much of the Vietnam situation, and all the media commented on this. They showed the pictures of the embassy staff and others trying to leave Vietnam after the Vietnam War by holding on to the helicopters. And we saw that same situation repeated in Afghanistan as people, many of them collaborators with the US government, with the government that invaded and occupied their country, tried to leave. They built this up as being everybody was afraid of the Taliban. I don't think that really is the case. I think that there were some, and a lot of the collaborators probably were frightened of the Taliban coming in. But you know, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. And the option was opened during this period, so short period of time, that there was the possibility of getting out of this country and coming to some of the richest countries in the world, the United States, the UK, and the other NATO nations that participated in Afghanistan and were bringing people out. And I think if that happened in any poor country in the world, if you said, there is a window now when you can get out, you would see a mass exodus from that country. So some of that is included in what we saw. I remember during the Vietnam War, marching through Times Square in New York, chanting, "An Loc Quan Tri, all of Vietnam will soon be free." An Loc and Quan Tri were two of the cities, and as the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese military were advancing through the country, these cities were falling so quickly, one after the other, because the support was artificial in the country. The majority of people, the vast majority in Vietnam, wanted the US out of their country. The same was true of Afghanistan. Except it went quicker. When we were chanting An Loc Quan Tri, all Vietnam will soon be free, and marching through Times Square, in the south end of Times Square at that point, that time, was the New York Times building. And they used to have this display in lights that would go around, and all the headlines would be circulating on this, and you could stand in Times Square and watch the headlines from the New York Times, often before it was even printed. And I remember this mass demonstration marching through Times Square, chanting, and all of a sudden the headline came on the New York Times board on the building: "An Loc falls to the Viet Cong." So very quickly this happened. We heard just perhaps a day before Kabul fell, the US says, well, Kabul will probably last for 3 more months. They knew they were dead. They knew they were losing, but it didn't last 3 months. It didn't last 3 months because, you see, the economy of Afghanistan was a false economy. It was propped up by trillions of dollars. Those trillions of dollars never really got to the people. As Jeff mentioned, 90% were making $2 or less Another figure I heard was 76% were below the poverty level. It never increased. That money really never got to people. But one place you could get a salary was to join the military. These were people who needed money. They needed to work. They needed to make a living. And they were not in it because they believed in the cause of these warlords that we saw leaving the country with helicopters filled with money. Some of it, they said, had to be left on a tarmac because they couldn't fill the helicopter with the cash they were leaving. They were trying to leave with. So the military dissolved. They had no belly for a fight, the Taliban. On the other hand, the Taliban, which is nothing progressive, of course, we as socialists support this kind of fanatical, religious, archaic group that's the Taliban. But the Taliban was the resistance to the United States in Afghanistan. And because of that, it gained support. They said it had around 100,000 fighters in Afghanistan at the time that Kabul fell. Another saying was that when one commander, because we used to say at one point, we got this commander of the Taliban, we got this commander of the Taliban. When one commander fell, 5 more jumped up to take his place. The people of Afghanistan did not want the United States and did not want NATO in their country. What people would? Would they want someone with a different religion, with a different culture, that spoke a different language to dominate their country and determine what would happen in that country? Nobody wants that. Polls showed, as of last January, an AP poll was done in Afghanistan, and they said only 33% wanted the US to stay. That means 2/3 didn't want the US to stay in their country. 80% said when they saw these foreign military in their country, they felt fear. But the narrative that the United States tried to project was that the people wanted us in Afghanistan. And it was this small group of terrorists that were terrorizing the whole country and wanted them out. The terror to that country, to Afghanistan, was the US and the NATO forces. The figure that I heard of the number of deaths during the 20-year war was 240,000. Jeff mentioned 500,000 because they're all estimates. It's difficult to tell. You can't count the numbers. The US has always tried to downplay, especially for civilian casualties. But even that number, 250,000 people in a country the size of Afghanistan being killed by that war, there were massive bombings and drone strikes that took place. We talked about the Julian Assange and the Afghan papers, but another whistleblower we should remember is Daniel Hale, who just was sent to jail for 4 years because he revealed in papers that were supposed to be classified that the vast majority of the people killed in drone strikes were civilians. And as the US was leaving, we saw this again. We saw a drone strike take place in Kabul where a car was hit and 10 people from a family were killed. The US narrative, what the US said at that time was that they got suicide bombers that were on the way to the airport. It turned out that this was civilians. The US lied, as the Afghan papers showed. The US lied all along to the American people. They tried to lie again at that particular time, and it was once again exposed. But this is the way the bombings and the drone strikes went all throughout the time of the 20 years in Afghanistan. Besides the bombings, there were the black sites, the Bagram Air Force bases, sites used for torture. Hundreds and thousands were tortured and by the U.S. military. Doors were knocked down in the middle of the night at times, especially when we had the peak of over 100,000 soldiers in there, and no one knows how many so-called contractors, or as we rightly call them, mercenaries, were there. We terrorized that entire country. Under the Taliban, they had almost stopped all poppy production, as Jeff mentioned, but it skyrocketed under the US occupation. And not only did that manifest itself in drugs on the streets of countries around the world, including the United States, but also there was a gigantic addiction rate of people in Afghanistan themselves. There certainly was no desire for the United States to stay in that country. It was a hell for the people of Afghanistan, and the real terrorists were the US military and the NATO forces that supported it. Now, besides the deja vu of Vietnam and Afghanistan and the way people were trying to leave and so forth, there's another deja vu that happened. And that is 20 years ago, when they started this war, we saw on all the corporate media in the US, and I assume in Canada and other places, military people, politicians, quote unquote, experts, usually from some academic institution or not, saying it was going to be a walk in the park, that it was going to be simple, that it was going to be a matter of weeks in Afghanistan. But what we said, what the anti-war movement said, we said, no, it's going to be another Vietnam. It's going to be another quagmire. It will be easy to get in. It will be hard to get out. US hands off. Now, 20 years later, they're trying to figure out what happened, and they're interviewing the same people, but they still are not interviewing the people that got it right. They are not interviewing the anti-war activists and others. Jeff's giving me the 1 minute signal. So let me just say this. After Vietnam, there was something called the Vietnam syndrome. People in the United States did not want to see another Vietnam. And although there were military operations and military throughout the US military throughout the whole world, we have military in 172 countries, 20 times the number of foreign bases as all other countries in the world combined. We didn't have another war like Vietnam for a whole generation. It took 9/11, and then it took before they were able to go into war again in the same kinds of ways that they did in Vietnam. But now they lost again, like they did in Vietnam. And this is a huge blow to US imperialism. Imperialism's not dead. The fact that they say it got these same experts and so forth saying the same kinds of things shows they intend to do the same thing over again. But there's now the possibility, and the likelihood of an Afghan syndrome. It's now the time that the anti-war movement needs to go on the offensive. We need to stop the drone strikes. We need to stop the bombings around the world. We need to stop the wars in Syria and Iraq and Yemen. We need to stop the sanctions in the 39 countries. And we will have a better reception after COVID, after the defeat of this war. Is the time for us to really build the anti-war movement. So that's something we need to do. We need to do together. Coalitions like UNAC are essential at this point. I urge organizations to join us. And at this time, let's go forward and build a strong anti-war movement.
Joe Lombardo, National Coordinator of UNAC, thank you so very much. I'd like to urge our listeners to join us via chat, ask your questions, and make your comments, and we'll respond. Check out our website, socialistaction.org, and watch our YouTube, where this program will be recorded, as well as other programs that we have every other week. In the meantime, I have a couple of comments. The first and most important comment is that the central uniting principle of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC, is US out now. But it's based on another principle, self-determination for poor and oppressed people around the world. We have no right in the United States to be the cop of the world, to destroy other people's economy by war, by sanctions, by drones, by secret operations. Even in Afghanistan, on day one of 9/11 20 years ago, the United States basically looked to Afghanistan and demanded that the government there, which we had been supporting, turn over Osama bin Laden. The reaction of the Afghan government that we put in place was basically just give us the evidence that he was responsible for the 9/11 bombing and we'll turn him over. Or we'll turn him over to an international court that can adjudicate it. The United States thought that was a joke and began bombing the country into smithereens 20 years later. The United National Anti-War Coalition and Socialist Action and the other many, many groups affiliated with UNAC started with the principle that the United States didn't have the right to be the cop of the world, destroy another country. They had the right to determine their own future, even if we in the socialist movement or UNAC's components disagreed with their politics, didn't think they were revolutionary enough. We rejected the idea that the United States had the right to intervene. Of course, why did the United States intervene? Because it wanted military bases on the borders of China. It wanted, and Russia, it wanted to control the trade routes across that country. It wanted to, among other things, be first on the pile to exploit Afghanistan's lithium resources that stood as the greatest in the world at $3 trillion. The Obama administration was serious about the war. When it was failing, Obama presided over a surge in his administration, that maximized the number of US troops to 120,000. 120,000 of the most well-armed military forces in the world was sent in to defeat a ragtag army of the Taliban. A huge number of those forces, perhaps half, for the first time in history, were privatized army death squad forces organized by the Blackwater Corporation. That is, mercenaries for pay that were to do the bidding of American corporations. 50,000, 56,000 Afghan troops were trained. By the way, as Joe mentioned, a number of them joined the army because it was a place for a job. Others joined the Afghan army because they were Taliban and they wanted weapons and training. That was the best place to get them. And they turned those weapons against the United States government. It reminds me of the US civilization building and entering Afghanistan reminds me of a classical dark joke that I must repeat to our audience. It was the days of Barry is already laughing in advance. It was the days of the Roman Empire, gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum, and the Colosseum orchestrators of the combat decided to have a fight, a fair fight, between a black slave who they had captured and were using for the entertainment of the crowd, and a lion in hand-to-hand combat. They wanted to make it a fair fight. So they buried the black slave with his hands tied behind his back up to his neck. And then they released the lion, who charged the slave. And at the moment of lopping off his head, the lion happened to whirl about and his tail got stuck in the slave's mouth, who gave it a mighty bite, at which point the lion, momentarily stunned, jumped up into the air and banged his head against the wall. And one person in the Colosseum said, fight fair to the Vietnamese when they face the most modern army in the world. Fight fair to the oppressed people of the world who dare to fight back with the primitive weapons they have against the most well-armed army in the history of the planet Earth. Think about that. How else can we explain the fact that the greatest army that has ever existed on the planet Earth was defeated? And yet every newspaper in the country today blames it on their would-be slaves, the Afghanistan people. What a horror that we are witnessing today. The first act of the United States on day 2 was to freeze $9.5 billion in Afghan monies in US banks. And the IMF, that the United States similarly controls, froze $400 million. They now want to starve the Afghanistans out, bring them to the point of hunger, so they will cut deals allowing the American exploitation of their countries. So UNEC's position, our position, is that the imperial racist beast has no rights in any country on earth. The simple principle that poor people deserve the right, must have the right to run their own countries. So with that, let me turn for briefer comments to our speakers. Barry Weisletter, Federal Secretary, Socialist Action Canada, the floor is yours.
I thought it would be a good idea to turn on the microphone for some reason. Well, those were some illuminating comments. I look forward to questions and comments from the audience, but I'll make a couple of points now. The first is about material interest. And Jeff correctly described the rich lithium resources that are to be found across Afghanistan. There are other valuable mineral resources, but it's also the geopolitical interest of the imperialists that drives them to war in Central Asia. And I'm going to mention one causation. North of Afghanistan is a large body of water called the Caspian Sea. And there's a lot of oil in and around that big lake in Asia. And if you want to move that oil from the Caspian Sea basin to oil tankers on the Indian Ocean, you can go through Iran, but that's not such an easy proposition for US-based corporations. So you might be tempted to want to build some pipelines through Afghanistan and then through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean. And that was the dream of some wealthy oil barons, but it didn't work out. But nonetheless, it was a factor in the reckoning of American imperialism and its NATO allies. One of the reasons for a war that killed so many people because of the greed of a tiny, tiny minority of resource barons. Another thing I want to mention is our proud legacy, our experience in the movement against the war in Afghanistan. So I'm wearing a button here. I'm sure you can see it. Canada out of Afghanistan. I haven't worn this button for a few years. We Socialist Action Canada commissioned an artist to design this and produced thousands of copies of this button and sold most of them to people at anti-war demonstrations. And we were a factor, a small factor, but we're proud of our participation in the movement that persuaded the only mass union-based labor party in North America, the New Democratic Party, which is not to be confused with the Democratic Party in the United States. This party in Canada is linked to the unions and is a a right-wing social democratic party, but nonetheless an independent expression of the workers' movement in Canada. There was a convention in Quebec City in 2006, and we led the fight on the convention floor, Canada out of Afghanistan. I remember the chair at one point trying to interrupt me before I launched into the main body of my argument, said, we need to study this issue. We need to ask the Canadian people where they stand on this war, right or wrong. Which way should we go? And my response was, the Canadian people, the working class, have already expressed themselves in demonstrations across the country. We want to end the war and end our participation in it immediately. And there was thunderous applause, not because of my eloquence, but because of the pitch of the moment that this unjust war had already earned the disgust, the enmity of millions of people around the world. And that policy to demand Canada out of Afghanistan carried the convention. And the very next day, Jack Layton, then the leader of the NDP, was described in Canada's leading daily newspaper as Taliban Jack. Well, he never deserved that moniker in any sense of the word. But it showed the power of the movement in the streets, that we could mobilize hundreds and then thousands and tens of thousands of people against an unjust war in Asia, and to get the only mass labor-based political party in North America to take a principled stand on that war, to actually campaign for it, and then that position has been vindicated now. Yeah, okay. So in the interest of time, I'll stop right there. But I just, in closing, point to the button that is situated right beside and somewhat below Canada out of Afghanistan, and that's hands off Venezuela, because imperialism never sleeps. And the anti-war movement and the socialist movement must never rest until we have eradicated capitalism and imperialism and all wars that rob people of their freedom and self-determination. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. We have a chat question from one of our observers. Are there any anti-imperialist women's organizations in Afghanistan? Let's get to that in the course of the panel. Joe, the floor is yours. Joe Lombardo, National Coordinator, United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. You're muted, Joe. You got to unmute. Thank you.
How's that? Is that any better? Barry mentioned a couple of times Malalai Joya. People may remember a few years ago, UNAC sponsored a tour of the United States for Malalai Joya, a very successful tour. She got to speak to a lot of people, got on Democracy Now! At that point also. Recently, Democracy Now! Contacted me and asked if I knew a way to get in touch with her again, so they could interview her. And I did get in touch with her, and I put them in contact, and she was on Democracy Now! Recently speaking about the situation. Now, unlike the leaders of the government, the puppet government that the US had been propping up, the warlords of the Northern Alliance, Malalai Joya is still in Afghanistan and has stayed there. Her life was in danger under the Northern Alliance warlords, and every night pretty much she had to sleep in a different place, have bodyguards. There were several attempts on her life, but she was a women's activist and women's rights activist in Afghanistan. She was the youngest person ever elected to the Afghan legislature in a legitimate way, from a province in the east. And what she did when she got into that legislature, she condemned the warlords, the US occupation, and spoke out for women's rights. And some of these legislatures who come from these warlords had guns. So they almost killed her right in the legislature there. They ran her out, and she had to go into hiding. A few years later, you might remember, the U.S. was saying this is a great, our being there is a great thing for women's rights. And they pressured these warlords that they have to get more women. The one elected legitimately, they drove out, but they had to get more women in the legislature. So the next election, there were a bunch of women that were elected. We also have the pictures of the stuffing of the ballot boxes and so forth that they did. But the women that were primarily elected at that point were the wives and the handpicked people of these warlords. And now they can say there were women in the legislature. Malala Joya on that Democracy Now! Program, she was asked the question, has this been something that helped women's rights in Afghanistan? And she said, well, the US came in there and they took us out of the frying pan and they threw us into the fire. The warlords are no better and have never been any better than the Taliban was on women's rights. For the vast majority of people in the country, there has been no change in the position of women's rights. There were very few in small bubbles in Kabul and upper class people who got some kind of rights, but for the vast majority, that didn't happen. Barry mentioned some instances to show that if, well, the US is interested in women's rights, why are they not interested in human rights in different places? But right now in this country, in the United States, abortion rights are under attack. These rights that were gained during that same period of the Vietnam War, when there were mass upsurges and mass movements, and one fed the next. The civil rights fed the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement fed the women's movement. And I marched in that same area that I marched in Vietnam for women's rights and abortion rights in New York, and New York passed it, abortion rights, and then it came out throughout the whole country. But every single day, women and men and their supporters have to fight to keep every single right that we won through struggle. The United States will never uphold women's rights. They will never uphold democracy in any country because the interest of the ruling class, a very, very minority group of people in this country, can never be fed through democracy or for the rights of people. They have to keep people divided. They have to figure out undemocratic ways to keep a minority in power, and the same is true with Afghanistan.
Thank you, Joe Lombardo. We have a comment from Bronwyn from Minneapolis. I appreciate the details of Canadian Parliament's actual motivation for joining the American-led military invasion and occupation of Afghanistan as being US military spending. Thank you, Bronwyn. I'm sure Barry will comment. I will add that there is an organization of Afghan women that has been around for decades. It's called RAWA, Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. Their position has been, to my knowledge, very similar to Malala's. They are against the imperialist beast in Afghanistan and demand its removal. And at the same time, they have no confidence in the Taliban government. They want to and will continue the fight for women's rights. And how they will do that, I don't know, but you can check them out at RAWA, Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan. The main point that I would make in regard to this is that after what you've heard in listening to our speakers today, if anyone still suffers under the illusion that the United States is going to bring peace and democracy and women's rights to Afghanistan, they're a bit blind to the reality. The reality is the United States has presided over the dismemberment of Afghanistan society, the slaughter of its people. The amazing thing is that within a few days, the governments in 410 districts, that is all of the districts and all of the provinces of Afghanistan, surrendered without a fight. most of them turned over the authority to the Taliban. The soldiers turned over their weapons to the Taliban. How could you explain that after 20 years of US civilization, the government of the United States had no support? We don't hear that in the monopoly corporate media. In Syria, for example, we're told that the dictator Bashar Assad is responsible for atrocities. But the truth is that when the Gallup poll associated organization in Great Britain polled the Syrian people, they found that less than 10% supported the US government coalition, the willing coalition. I mean, a majority supported the government of Syria, the Bashar Assad government. Not necessarily because they thought it was such a great government, but because they didn't support the imperialist beasts presiding over the slaughter in conjunction with ISIS, I should say, in Syria, of the Syrian people. Same thing in every country in the world. The Obama administration presided over 7 wars simultaneously, including the slaughter of Libya that led to the dismemberment of that country, the destruction of its infrastructure. Our point in UNAC and in Socialist Action Canada, and with regard to Socialist Action itself, is that the oppressed people of the world know better. Not a single place on earth do the people welcome the bombing of their country and its subordination to US banking institutions and the rich. Out now is our credo. So we have another question or comment. The capitalists have never lost money from the Afghanistan invasion, and their media has pretty much prevented any large-scale anti-war movement in the United States. So why did they finally pull out? Is it that they have somewhere else to go? Well, we'll discuss that. Why did they get out of Afghanistan after 20 years, after the longest war in history? I'll turn to our speakers, Barry Weissletter, Federal Secretary of Socialist Action Canada, Joe Lombardo. In the meantime, check out our website, socialistaction.org. You can reach us by email, socialistaction@lmi.net. Barry, the floor is yours for brief comments. We're running out of time. So let's wrap it up with another couple of rounds of 2 minutes each, and we'll go from there. Barry,
oh, 2 minutes. This would be a record for Jeff. Let's see if I can come close. Well, do they have somewhere else to go? No, they don't have to go somewhere else. They're everywhere. The American state has military bases in hundreds of places around the world. I mean, maybe over 1,000 bases. Jeff will know the actual figure. I'm not sure I have enough fingers and toes to count that high, but they're everywhere. And anytime working people fight for justice, fight for self-determination, fight for their freedom, fight for control over their economy, over their resources, over their future, they're stymied by intervention. And it's one coalition of the willing after another. If it can't be done through the UN, if it can't be done through NATO, they patch together a coalition. So they're ready to intervene everywhere and always, which is why opponents of war, opponents of capitalist exploitation, opponents of the denial of self-determination to oppressed nations have to be at the ready constantly. And the reason they were forced out of Afghanistan is because they had no base, no social base in the country of any significance. They provided salaries for a few 100,000 people, and those are largely the folks that want to leave. And they're regarded by their countrymen as collaborators with the imperialist invaders. You know, I don't particularly wish them ill, but we do need to understand that many of the people who want to leave, lived a privileged existence under the occupation for a time. And we need to put an end to privilege, and Afghanistan needs an economic development program. And the imperialists who devastated the country should damn well be paying reparations. It should help to rebuild the economy, not by dictating the terms, but providing infrastructure tools so that the people there can develop their own industry and participate in the world and feed and house their own people. I'm going to add something about the Trudeau government today. And there are 5 parties in Parliament, and there's an election taking place on September the 20th. Some people will vote at advanced polls or by mail-in ballots because of COVID, but the election is slated for September the 20th. And Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, the son of Pierre Trudeau, a previous Liberal prime minister, claims to be a feminist. And despite his claims, the Trudeau government, which has had a minority government for the last 2 years and a majority government before that for 4 years, did not deliver on promises for a national childcare program that they'd been making for 40 years. They did not deliver on promises to provide clean drinking water, housing, and education on Indigenous people, First Nations communities across the country. They continue to provide subsidies for oil and gas for the big resource polluters. And, you know, Canada is the 3rd worst in the world in terms of carbon emissions after Saudi Arabia and Australia. Did you know that? So don't think of the Mounties. Think about the bloody pipeline leaking all over the countryside and causing ecological disaster. So the Justin Trudeau government in 2019 actually increased the Canadian military budget, spending more money on the building of fighter jets and warships, as well as the ground forces. This from a so-called feminist government. That's why we're out to defeat the Trudeau government. We're out to defeat the Tories. They're no better, nor for that matter is the Bloc Québécois or the Green Party. We do have allies in Afghanistan. I think we should mention one of them, the Radical Left Party of Afghanistan. You can Google the name and see what they have to say. They opposed both the imperialist intervention, and they see a reconstitution of the working class to fight against the bourgeois Taliban government and the other contenders on the right in that country. On September 20th, we hope to register a progressive working class socialist vote in opposition to war and in opposition to climate injustice. And that vote will take the form of, in a distorted way, of the labor-based New Democratic Party, which is running at about 20% right now, which could lead to a doubling in the number of seats in Parliament. But that's not the crucial thing, seats in Parliament. It's encouraging people to protest in the streets against war and against imperialist devastation. That's where we're putting our hopes.
Thank you, Barry Weisleiter, Federal Secretary, Socialist Action Canada. Joe Lombardo, the floor is yours.
Well, see, I think the government of the United States, the powers that be, fear a mass movement. They do everything they can to prevent a mass movement, and there's reasons why we have not been able to build a mass anti-war movement right now, and we can go into them, but 2 minutes does not give me enough time to do that. But they fear a mass movement. You might remember when Obama said he was going to send missiles into Syria. There was a huge outcry in the United States, and he had to go onto TV and back down, say, okay, I won't send the missiles. That was an amazing victory. He did it because he feared that the sentiment was so much against it that if he did it, it could lead in the direction of a mass movement. They have all the resources on their side. They have the wealth, they have the media, they have 2 big business parties in the United States and others in Canada. I can't speak with the same authority about Canada, but Barry can. And what we have is just that their policies, including the war in Afghanistan, is against the interest of the people of Afghanistan and the people of the United States. So it can lead to building of a mass anti-war movement if they do the wrong things. So sometimes they have to make decisions. And so there is power just in what people think. I'm not being an anti-materialist by saying that, but when people are against war and they move towards war, they know that can engender a mass movement. And we have the power, if we are organized, the people in the United States and around the world have the power, if we are organized and have the correct leadership, to end their power simply by not cooperating, putting our hands in our pockets, not going to work, not doing what they want. We can bring the entire thing down. And they always fear that. So our main weapon is to build everything we do in the direction of a mass movement and mass participation and mass consciousness. They had to get out of Afghanistan because they couldn't win there. They did not have the ability to win, but they also could not use a nuclear weapon or do the kind of mass occupation over a long period of time that would have been necessary, because that would have changed the consciousness of people and led in a direction of a mass movement. And so they had to eventually leave Afghanistan after 20 years. That's an amazing amount of time. You think about it, the majority of the Taliban fighters were probably, not the majority, but a lot of Taliban fighters were not even born 20 years ago. It's a very youthful country, Afghanistan. And many, many things have changed. So anyway, I believe that's why they left. They didn't want to leave. They have this whole pivot to Asia that they're doing. They're afraid of the Belt and Road initiative that China's doing as really being in competition with what they are doing, their whole international project of trade and monetary. It is strategically located with Pakistan. They bombed Pakistan. The Afghan war was also in Pakistan. There were these drone strikes throughout Pakistan. They're on the border with Iran and China and the former Soviet republics that have all this oil. It's a very strategic thing, but the power of the consciousness of people in the United States and around the world has changed it. And I had the opportunity to be in Europe when the US left or was leaving. I just got back to the United States today. It was very interesting to watch the news media there. Things have changed. There was a whole discussion that was going on as the US lost its leadership role in the world. Should we be following the US leadership? I was in Britain, which is following the US leadership. It's building its own space force, just like the United States. It's increasing its military budget. Well, after this whole COVID epidemic and people praising the National Health Service and the nurses, they had the audacity, the British government, to offer them a 1% raise when they haven't had a raise for years. And, the whole country almost exploded over that. I think this has hurt the United States in a very deep way and hurt their imperialist project. And I think this is a very good thing for the anti-war movement and for people that are opposed to US imperialism around the world.
Thank you, Joe Lombardo. Let me make some final, maybe closing comments. First, one of the speakers today said that the Afghanistan people after 20 years didn't benefit by the US invasion. It's among the poorest countries in the world. It was run by a US appointed, totally corrupt government. So what does it mean when we say that the United States spent 2.6, some people say $2.4 trillion on the war? You have to understand that the total military budget annually of the United States is roughly $1 trillion for the whole world. So they spent 2.6 trillion in Afghanistan. That's a grammatical mistake. They spent $2.6 trillion in purchasing manufacturing war materials from the richest corporations in the world, the ones that Barry mentioned, McDonnell Douglas, Drummond, and the others, because this is the most highly monopolized section of the US economy, because there are only 4 or 5 corporations that produce these aircraft and missiles and guns and tanks. They have a monopoly, so they can charge as much as they want. For example, I challenge Barry and Joe to tell me the cost of a toilet seat on a nuclear submarine. Take a wild guess.
$20,000.
You're
I
close.
guess it's more than an $800 hammer, Jeff.
It's $10,000 for a toilet seat. When they asked the McDonald,
I meant 2 for 20.
right? When they asked the McDonnell Douglas chair, CEO, what they charged the government to make an F-22 jet plane, and as opposed to their costs, the CEO laughed and said, there's no correspondence between the actual value of the jet and what we charge. That is, they can charge 10 times because there's no competition for jet planes. And in fact, the Congress appropriates funds to some of these aircraft manufacturing industries to produce, quote, unlimited numbers, as many as you want. We'll sell them around the world and use them around the world. So war is profitable for capitalism. That's a fundamental aspect of it, in addition to being for geopolitical control, over trade routes, over control of the Asian markets, over oil. You know, the Saudi government is among the largest supporters of the Taliban. They have the same Sunni Wahhabi religion. And yet, the United States has Saudi Arabia as its central ally in the Middle East, only second to Israel in the amount of money that it spends in providing that country, as well as Israel, $3 billion a year to Israel in military aid. So war is profitable. On the reasons for the war, well, the reason for the Afghanistan war is that they wouldn't turn over Osama bin Laden. But he was murdered in Pakistan 10 years later and spent most of his life outside of Afghanistan. The pretext for the war in Vietnam was that a warship of the United States was fired on by the equivalent of a Vietnamese sampan. So Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and conducted a 10-year war that killed 4 million people. In Syria, they said that the government of Syria was using poison gases or other excuses. In Libya, they said that the Gaddafi government was on the verge of slaughtering 50,000 protesters in Benghazi. It never happened in Libya, and yet that country was destroyed. And my guess is that the resources of that country, the oil resources, are in the hands of the United States. The United States killed 1.4 million people in the Iraq wars by death and destruction and starvation and sanctions on the grounds that the president of that country, Saddam Hussein, was about to use, quote, weapons of mass destruction in the United States. Today, virtually every elected official said there were no such weapons of mass destruction. And yet they killed 1.4 million people. And today, top politicians like Biden say, well, that was a mistake. That war was a mistake. 1.45 million people dead, and that was a mistake. But the mistakes are inherent in the capitalist system: war and racism and poverty. And I'll close on this. The United States government faces multiple crises. COVID where the United States, the most advanced, sophisticated nation in the world, has the largest number and percentage of its population infected with COVID and the largest number of deaths. Some, what is it, 600, 700, 800, if not 1,000 people die every day in the most advanced country in the world. Whereas revolutionary Cuba, if I may hit you with an aside, has a plan in the next 2 months to vaccinate the entire population. The United States hasn't yet inoculated half of its population. Even Europe is up to 70%, but fully vaccinated in the United States is less than 50%. It has a crisis of legitimacy with regard to COVID, with regard to unemployment, with regard to rising poverty in the United States, with regard to systemic racism, which is why 20 to 26 million people, mostly Black, but whites as well, mobilized after the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. George Floyd was a symbol of what is the norm every day. The United States is #1 in the world in the number and percentage of its people incarcerated, the majority Black, Latino, and Native Americans. Plus, the United States is #1 in the world. Barry asked about military bases. The United States has 1,100 military bases in over 100 countries because it's profitable. It's profitable to make guns, not provide food. And the final crisis is the crisis of the environment, where today the world is ablaze with fires everywhere, with destructive floods in New Orleans, but across Europe, because of the continued insistence on fossil fuels, which are the main driver of the greenhouse gases. And yet the United States is engaged in endless wars for oil, the very product whose continued use spells literally doom. I live in California, and the fires are literally within miles of the vast area surrounding Lake Tahoe. So death and destruction, slaughter and disease, COVID and racism are inherent in the capitalist system. That's why we exist in our party. That's why we're proud to have a sister party, Socialist Action Canada, and we're proud to work with the United Front, ever democratic organizing vehicle of United National Anti-War Coalition. So with that, because I don't want to have the last word, I'll give it to Barry and Joe for a 1-minute summary. We'll thank our audience for participating. Check us out at socialistaction.org and socialistaction@lmi.net. Barry and Joe, you have a minute to wrap it up, and then we'll say goodbye to our audience. Thank you to our engineer, Lisa, from Minneapolis, and to our friends and supporters. Barry, you got the final word. You're muted. I'm trying to read your lips, but I can't do it.
Yeah, I turned on the mic. I thought that would help this time again. Peace, justice, economic democracy, a world with an environmental future. All of these things are incompatible with capitalism. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and it knows no bounds in terms of its destructive power. We need to stay in the fight, and the source of our power as working people is mobilization in the streets. I'm so glad to have participated in this discussion. It's thank you, Lisa, for hosting. Thank you, Jeff, for inviting. Great to see Joe again. You're doing a tremendous job in the Anti-War Coalition. Socialist Action Canada is proud actually to be one of the international affiliates of your broad coalition. I just want to say to folks here, you've heard the discussion. I hope you've been moved by the passion of the arguments that we've made. If you're not already a member of Socialist Action in the United States, what the hell are you doing? Get up and join and get to be part of a movement that can change the world for the better. Join Socialist Action USA, join Socialist Action Canada, join UNAC, and together we will win. Venceremos.
Thank you, Barry. Joe, you have the final word. And you two are muted, Joe.
Not anymore. Uh, well, thanks, Jeff and Barry and Lisa, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk with all of you. I was happy to be here. I'd urge people to go to UNAC's website, which is unacpeace.org, UNACPEACE.org. See some of the work we're doing. If you are a member of an organization that is not a member of UNAC, I'd urge you to hit the join button there and join. And if you are just an individual, please get on our email list. Some important things coming up this fall that we're going to be involved in. And as I said, the anti-war movement needs to really move into high gear, and we're going to try to do that, but we can't do that without help. So I urge everybody to join with us, participate, and let's go forward together. unacpeace.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, our engineer, Lisa, and we'll call it a night.
Take care, everyone.